I mean, I might just start at like the most granular point and ask you,
Hmm.
like, what have you been listening to recently? And like, what's captured your imagination sonically in like recent times?
Okay, oh, that's a really good question. So yeah, so I think like at the moment, like I'm often listening to stuff with a view to like, can we get them to come to Cumbria?
Sure, sure.
And often that's not possible, but occasionally it is. So been listening a lot to an artist called Lonnie Holley, who's a sort of
Mm.
American visual artist, sculptor, in his 70s. And he's got a new album out, which I've been listening to quite a lot. He's coming to play in November.
Ooh, amazing.
So quite excited about that.
What kind of music is it?
It's kind of like it's pretty unusual. I mean, it's kind of like he's got this very sort of plaintive, sort of untutored singing voice,
Mm.
and it's often these kind of like quite. Um, I suppose he makes this kind of like almost like folk art, and
Mm.
I think he works with sound in a similar way that it's like an assemblage of found sounds. But then he does work, he works with some pretty big producers as well occasionally and collaborators. Um,
Interesting.
so yeah, I've been enjoying that. That's called Tonki is the name of that album. That's been
Tonky.
Tonki. That's been on quite a bit.
Nice.
I've been listening to. I'm a really big fan of Arthur Russell. I don't know if you've come across him. He's like a New York cellist,
Mm.
minimalist cellist, disco innovator
Whoa.
from the early 80s.
What a pedigree.
He's like I came across him about 20 years ago, and like sadly, like he died in the sort
Mm.
of late 80s. But his partner has been like gradually releasing stuff from his archive over the last 20 years, and they just released. He made this album called like World of Echo, which is it's like this cello that's really like drenched in reverb and distortion and delay, and then him sort of improvising these songs with his cello.
Wow.
And they just released some tapes, which are like the live shows that he did, uh, which which he then used to develop this album. So that's been a real sort of treat. Um,
Amazing. I mean, that sounds, I mean, very much in keeping with, I guess, like standing or residual, like sonic interest that I have personally. I mean, I listen to like a lot of John Hassel.
okay, yeah,
Less Eno, strangely enough. Like, I'm also working with this really, really smart guy. His name's Rajan. He's out in India. He's going to start his postgraduate work in Canada soon, and we're trying to work out like a sort of like some kind of ethics or theory of ambient music.
okay,
Maybe using the least wieldy theorists to do it. It's
right,
part of the challenge. It's this kind of like, death of creativity is the ease of use sort of mantra. Like just to, so I mean, Hassel's like, I mean, I've seen some of his recordings of his live shows
yeah,
where he's got like all these pedals and really interesting like Ableton setups and so on, and like this the flinty quality that he can get out of the brass is like
hmm,
really interesting. It sounds more like a pad than it does like
yeah,
I think when a lot of
yeah,
people think when they think and see brass, they expect bombast. They expect something quite penetrative and quite confronting, I think, sonically.
yeah,
But Hassel, I mean, also obviously, I've been thinking a lot about the Caretaker and obviously Basinski in regard to that ambient stuff. But and maybe Eno because of his recent open letter that he put out. But I'm thinking of Pharaoh Saunders as well, and the stuff that he did with floating points.
yeah,
Because that whole record is kind of the same song. Like it could be one massive piece. I
yeah,
think like it's the same key all the way like through, same progressions, and it's just Pharaoh, doing Pharaoh stuff. Which I guess leads, I guess that's some of what I'm like. I listen to this stuff kind of all the time, but like, plaintive singing and kind of untutored voice. The one that like would fit that appellation that I listen to most often is King Cruel.
okay,
Um,
yeah, yeah, it's great.
yeah, all due respect to Archie. I don't think he's the best singer, but like I think that's it's so much to his favor.
Yeah,
I listen to the Ooze like all the time.
yeah,
And it's so great. But also this folk revival, and I don't know whether because my partner's younger than I am, and she listens to a lot of these interesting sort of like young musicians who are coming out of like a kind of internet milieu and are responding in real time to socio-political events and pressures. And there's this real sort of like folkloric, like neo-Dylan-esque sensibility that
Mm.
sort of like is coming out. But like, I mean, the writing is so much more direct
Yeah.
insofar as like leveling a socio-political commentary or critique. Um, and I mean, I guess that leads me to ask you, like, have you ever do you fancy yourself like a songwriter? Because I can't write like song lyrics. I can write raps, but I can't
Yeah.
write like lyrics to save my life. I just can't do it.
No, not at all. I mean, I should probably point out, like we when we started, we were an artist collective of five,
Yeah.
and I'm actually a print like my master's is in printmaking.
Wow.
So, but then I did develop my practice into working with musicians and sound, and then got into improvising and sort of playing with electronics and strange like
Mm,
homemade objects and things. So like I've absolutely never a bit tried or been able to write a song. I think
sure.
it's probably like totally beyond me. But now like we've changed quite a bit and now I have colleagues who like can do that. And then
Sure.
it's quite nice actually. Like sometimes
Mm,
we'll do a bit of improv on a lunch break or
mm.
we'll just play some covers of like old songs on our lunch break. That's been really fun actually, like to go from this sort of
So cool.
doing this purely experimental stuff to actually playing with people that can do that kind of more song based stuff.
Sure.
Um, but I think I think the closest I've got like when I moved to Barrow originally, I came to do a residency at the local football ground, not being like having no knowledge or sort of background in football. And I was really into this composer called Robert Ashley, who's again
Yeah.
like American, does these kind of like they're sort of operas, but the singers are kind of speaking to a pitch and they're speaking very rapidly and
Mm.
doing this sort of stream of consciousness. So I made a sort of Robert Ashley inspired piece about Barrow Football Club, and we did,
Wow.
and with some local, like a young actor and some local musicians, and we got it into a couple of opera festivals in London, and it was really like we played it at the small Royal Opera House, to like 400 people. Um, it went down pretty well, but then other places people were just totally bemused by it. They're like, "What is this?" So I'm really into that thing of like using text. I was using a lot of found texts from old
Sure.
newspapers and programs and like lists of dead players, and then
Mm.
we made a chord. We made like Barrow Amateur Football Club is 4 note BAFC. We
Yeah.
tuned a bunch of string instruments to BAFC, and then we were playing these sort of drones using those notes. So
That's so
that's
cool.
like a long way of saying, yeah, not really managed to write a song, but have done some sort of more formal pieces that have got a structure
Sure.
and a sort of concept, but
I mean,
not
that's
not music.
amazing. I mean, that's so innovative. And yeah, I mean, I find as a sort of like the appellation even feels weird, but like as a musician and somebody who like, tries to communicate this in a pedagogical remit, but also is just somebody who likes to, who just, I mean, I've often said it at the risk of over egging the pudding, but like as a species, I do think that the only redemptive thing that we've ever done is make music. It's the only thing that I think could like really stand to any kind of like scrutiny, severe or partial. And because of this, like I'm just so interested in the way in which there's this kind of dithyrambic force that like is not necessarily curtailed, but trying, contoured in certain respects by these formal constraints that we superimpose onto sort of this just things like resonance and frequency and pitch and intensity.
Mhm.
Um, and finding ways to do that within like existing architectures and ossatures, but then presenting it to a modern audience and then being like, what the hell is this? Like, I think of Wagner and the
Mm.
Gesamtkunstwerk and like this idea of a total artwork,
Mhm.
like the one that's also so steeped in a place. That's like it's a really cool project, which leads me to ask, I guess, like, because you did mention your other sort of co-founders and colleagues, like, how did it all come together? And like when you look at it now versus where it started, like what is the most interesting part of that journey that you can sort of reflect on?
Yeah, I think originally like it was partly came out of like sort of chance and frustration. I think like a mix of like moving here, doing this great residency, and then it being like tumbleweeds of like there's not
Mm,
really no opportunities to make sort of contemporary or experimental sound
sure.
or visual art at the time. This is sort of like going back to 2008. Um, and yeah, and I suppose like the internet kind of being at an
Mhm.
earlier stage and that at that point as well, like
Yeah.
just being able to starting to be able to upload files and stuff, but
Yeah.
not, not in the way that um, not in the way that we do today. And then I think like had a sort of chance meeting with Andrew Deakin, who was one of the other co-founders, and he founded the first Sonic Arts university course in the country in
Mm,
Middlesex. And when I was studying in London, I was friends with a lot of the students who were on that course. So when I met him, like I sort of worked out who he was,
mm,
and then we had a really good chat, and then also met a couple of younger sort of local electronic musician DJs, and then we had this idea of like, well, let's put something on here, let's make a wish list, invite people, see
yeah.
what happens, and we were sort of lucky to yeah, we managed to like get some funding to do the first one. We invited lots of people. It was in the I don't know how much you know about Barrow, but it's mainly you might have seen the news this week. They've just allocated another like £1 zillion to build nuclear submarines here.
I did see
That's the
that.
big
Yeah, I
thing.
saw that
Yeah.
bulletin. Yeah.
So our first festival, it was in the old there's an old canteen building on the edge of the shipyard. So it's surrounded by these huge sheds, which are like maximum security and stuff. And we did this festival, and part of it was to sort of critique the
Hmm.
town's relationship with a major arms manufacturer. That everyone works there, and it has this kind of like disproportionate sort of influence on the local politics and the economy and
Yeah.
people's well-being and like and this horrible and this contrast of like you have this facility and across the road you have like one of the most sort of socio-economically deprived estates in the country,
Yeah.
and they're kind of right next to each other. um, so part of our mission I think was to kind of like think about how do you explore some of those things sonically,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, and inviting a mix of like of musicians and sound artists to come and respond to that. Originally, we tried to get access to a decommissioned submarine
I was I was
as a
hoping you'd
residency
try.
space.
Yeah.
We really
That would be
tried,
amazing.
but we got at the last minute they sort of chickened out, and we did end up working with some ex-submariners on. We arranged some. We arranged Air Sonata, the Kirchwitter's sound poem for Morse code, and we did this like radio broadcast that went to resonance and around Europe of these
Boy.
guys doing Kirchwitters in Morse code, and then some Japanese noise artists performing together with them. So I think that kind of set the tone really of like
Hmm.
getting really exciting people here from as far away as Japan and America and Europe, getting them to do something a bit weird and to respond to the
Yeah.
plays. And they're the kind of like key things we've sort of kept hold of.
Hmm.
And I think in terms of where we are today, I think we look a bit more like at least on paper, we look a bit more like a proper arts organization. We're a national
Sure.
portfolio organization. We've got a building. We get regular funding. We're still pretty tiny, but we're able to do quite a lot more than we have
Sure.
done in the past. And we have we have like there's four of us now, and
Hmm.
uh, we've got a payroll, things like that. It's not so much a sort of side projects for anyone now. It's kind of like
Sure.
more or less full time. And I think the thing we've been able to do, we've got this old house in the park, in Barrow Park, which is one of the older buildings in the town, and we built just this small venue for like 50 people with the idea that
Hmm.
that's probably the maximum audience size for a lot of this stuff. So
Sure.
let's just make a room that's with good acoustics, and then and a nice kind of like kitchen and artist area. And so for the last 2 years, that's what we've been doing. We've been doing like workshops, film screenings, loads of concerts.
Wow.
We've been able to get a lot of exciting people to come and play. So, like last year, we had an artist called Tashi Wada, who's a sort of he's like a composer. He plays the bagpipes. His dad was Yoshi Wada, who was a flux kind of like major Fluxus artist who used to build these kind of extended bagpipes out of plumbing materials and stuff, and do these sort of like 20-hour drone pieces. So he came, he was touring, and he played like at the ICA somewhere in Bristol, and then with us. And it was like that's been really satisfying to get on
Mm,
that kind of map that people are coming and doing their only day in the north, and
sure,
they're doing
yeah, on
a
that
world tour.
circuit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's unbelievable. I mean, the scope, the no pun, etc., like the resonance, this kind of international appeal, and the sort of the way in which it's anchored to a specific locale, but at the same time from there kind of yeah, like it like ruptures all over the place in really interesting ways. I mean, because when I was first introduced to you and actually told, I was told by my mutual colleague, Nathan Jones, he was like, yo, dude, you got to go talk to Glenn. And I was like,
right.
okay. And it was interesting taking your card. And maybe this is just kind of like, I guess, a consequence of the way in which, yeah, contemporary music stands now and the way in which people respond to it, even in sort of quote unquote less mainstream, deltas and sort of
Yeah.
ravines and tributaries. Is that I'm like, is this a label?
Mm.
Is this is this distro? What is the ostensible mandate? And the what you've just described to me insofar as a sort of like, yeah, in the best possible inflection of a Wagnerian ideal, like it seems to be sort of reified in the most interesting way. Because the only other, when I think of small venues and I think of places which have tried to cultivate like a space to allow for experimentation, for improvisation, but also to kind of give like a physical locale where in which that can occur. Because I mean, most of my live performance music days were spent in Edinburgh.
Okay.
Some in Canada when I was doing my undergraduate in Victoria, Vancouver Island on the West Coast. I was in several bands, most terrible. One that was really, really good, actually. We're just
Okay.
finding our feet. And I had to leave. It was just a trio. And we, using like chaos pads and chaos oscillators and
Okay.
like Ableton and just sketchy mics and terrible connections, and so everything would just blow up and like melt all the time.
Okay.
But that kind of that joie de vivre, and I suppose sort of like Orson Wellesian like ignorance of like what we couldn't do allowed us to sort of really discover things that people wouldn't think of by virtue of the fact that our ignorance was an ally in that regard. But in Edinburgh, if you weren't, and this is, really not to cast dispersions, but if you weren't at that time anyway, so like from 2010 to about 2014, like if you weren't playing four to the floor techno, like there wasn't
Right.
really an ear
Okay.
in the city. You have to go to like Glasgow
Yeah.
or maybe Dundee or just go to Manchester, and so I was really frustrated by virtue of the fact that like the music that inspired me to make the music that I make now was very much out of these tiny collectives, specifically Low End Theory in LA.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and what they were doing specifically in the early days with like, Project Blowed and the Swim Team and No Can Do, all the people out of Brain Feeder, basically, where they started before
Mm.
Flying Lotus became what he became, or Daedalus, or Toki Monster, Teebs, etc. Um, there's something similar was happening in Glasgow with like Tough Wax, and this was before Lucky Me like really blew up with Hudson
Okay.
Mohawk and Rusty.
Mhm.
But like there was something quite small and like really intense and passionate. And what I found exceedingly like resonant with me was the openness to experimentation
Yeah.
and improvisation. And I just I think a lot of people talk a mean game about it, and I think in their minds they want to like it, but to experience it. Feels like risky to them, and it's a
Yeah.
risk that they won't necessarily subject themselves to. But like, I guess that leads me to ask, like, what have you noticed insofar as like, what are the most like, what's the demography and the makeup of the crowds that you pull? What are their usual I mean, obviously, you know put forward an array of different materials, but like, what's the usual sensibility of your usual attendees, would you say? Is that even fair to ask, or is it
Uh,
just so
it's
disparate that it's
it's pretty unusual, I'd say.
sure?
I think it's changed quite a bit. I think like there was a point where when we were a festival, I think
Hmm.
after about 5 years we got to a point where we did one in 2015, and I think like 70% of the audience are from London, Leeds,
Mm.
Manchester, Glasgow, and a really small. And then we were doing free. We always do stuff in the park. Like we had like a sort of reactive black bouncy castle that like played black metal when you bounced on it and it sort of reacted to the movement. So we
That's
was
amazing.
doing that stuff for the local residents, but it was really hard to get people to come to the evening stuff, to the concerts. And I think
Mm.
that's one reason for building this space is like we're in the main park that everyone comes to, and as a result,
Right.
we get new people coming in and just trying stuff. And I think since we've stopped being a festival and we've been doing regular stuff, um, we've got more people that are just up for coming to everything and just trying it, whatever it is. And I think
Hmm.
that's one thing we always say is like, even if this one isn't really for you, the next one might be.
Sure.
And if
Yeah,
and if
take a
it's not,
chance.
kind of where else are you going to go for a fiver on a Friday night
Yeah.
or whatever? But it's a real mix. I mean, we do have like there's one guy that comes with his three teenage sons and nephews. They're like 13 something. Pretty normal. They don't look like, electronic music, weird music people. They just come in.
Sure.
They come to everything. People in their 80s that come who are maybe like
Yeah.
more into visual arts, but kind of
Mm.
get some aspects of what we do. We get artists that come, uh, music people. We're just getting new people all the time, but it never looks like. I remember like going to things in when I was studying in London, and getting used to like seeing the same sorts of crowds at different things, or each
Yeah.
venue having a sort of a recognizable
Like a
demographic.
type. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
never really thinking like. I mean, I'm not the most like. I'm not like great at socializing, but I think the nice thing here is it's so small that you just have to chat to
Mm.
people and get to know them, and
Sure.
that feels really good. And in some way, that means that then if you're doing challenging stuff, it doesn't feel as scary because you're sitting there
Sure.
just you're not looking around thinking like I don't get this. What are the other people thinking? Because
Yeah.
you can just ask them, or like
Yeah.
they probably also like are a bit puzzled by it, or they're really into it.
Yeah.
So I think, and collectively, I think like there's been some really nice moments where um, we've had these sort of performances, a couple of performances where at the end people have been holding their breath, and there's been this kind of silence before anyone
Yeah.
applauds because everyone in the room is like totally locked in, and there's no, there's the bar, you don't have the noise of the bar staff like cleaning the
Yeah.
glasses or slamming the doors or whatever. It's like we like to create that thing of like everyone's listening, and
Yeah.
you can really appreciate the music. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's quite hard to describe. I mean, at the minute, I'm sort of quite proud of the spread of people that we've got at the moment that come to stuff. And it sort of genuinely feels like a lot of those people wouldn't get to see any
Mm.
of this stuff because you would have to go Manchester or further
Quite far
to get
afield.
them.
Yeah. If I were I you and were I a member of your team, I'd be very proud actually. Like I remember, I mean, I used to be part of a collective in Edinburgh called Zap,
Okay,
with three Zs.
right.
And you know, by virtue of the fact that it feels in so many ways that we're just, I mean this in the least self-congratulatory way. It really felt like we were like ahead of the curve in certain
Mm.
respects. I remember we got Machine Drum, we got
Wow.
Sid Rim, we got we got a Lunis, we got who's the one that we got Mount Kimby as well.
Did you?
And
Wow.
like
Right.
yeah, and I remember going for dinner with Sid Rim before the
Mm.
show. Like we're having pizza at Pizza Express, like one of the
Yeah.
fancy ones off of George the Fourth Bridge. And I was just like asking questions about like Vienna, and I was just
Mm.
asking me questions about like Dorian concept and like working, he was just so affable, so interesting, so generous, like
Mm.
because when we get to the venue there's like 12 people there like
Yeah.
who are like quote unquote true believers, but like there might be one or two people who are just curious peppered into the crowd. And I felt on the one hand, and with my collab, well, there was a whole team of us, but like the captain of that ship of fools was a guy called Richard Phillips Kerr Dickey. I used to DJ with him as well. There's a
Right.
pair called Team Antihistamine. He's
Okay.
allergic to everything, like tomatoes, chocolate. So,
Brilliant.
um, um, but like I remember him just going into quite intense personal debt
Mm,
because he loved the music so much, and the fact that like he had the ambition to shoot quite high,
yeah.
and then pulling people. We were so worried that they'd be so bored and like just kind of pissed off to sort of play to sort of what we considered to be barely a crowd. But I remember um, when Lapalux, when we got Lapalux to come and play. And in a situation like that, you half expect whoever it is that's performing to either be quite retentive, maybe
Mm,
quite guarded, to kind of phone it in. But
yeah.
every single one of them just like, they were playing like the rent was due. Like it was
Yeah.
it's some of the most innovative like live performances that I've like ever seen.
Mm,
And I felt so privileged and lucky because like it kind of felt like you were in an abbey somewhere else. Like, it's
yeah.
just you and the monks.
Yeah.
Like, and it was unbelievable. And the best shows that I've played as my old moniker Moto and my current moniker Slime King have been to sort of like I call them the friends and family shows where there's just
Yeah.
like barely anybody there. In Edinburgh, there was this one lady who just always attend my shows. I didn't know
Okay.
her. I never met her once.
Right.
On the older side of things, but she was always there. She'd wait till she'd show up from like for my set and then just like leave right after. I
Okay.
I regret not approaching her and being like, I don't know why you keep coming. Like,
Yes.
what's your deal?
Yeah.
But as you say, that kind of environment that you've cultivated, I think like the key, it seems to me that you've been able to cultivate and maintain is a sense of openness. And speaking of that, like maybe a bit of a left question, like what do you think is, in your view, is maybe the worst? Maybe it's like with the worst tendency in like contemporary music and contemporary listeners, like when it comes to music
Um, that's a
or
really good
habit, if you
question.
will.
Um, uh, I think there's a certain amount of like in terms of like programming curation or
Mm,
like promoters and stuff of that thing of like follow, like a certain artist will appear and then everyone will put them on for 6 months and then they'll move on to someone else and
sure.
it's like that kind of thing of um following trends. I don't
Yeah.
quite know where those come from, but I think um that's one thing that I felt like we've always tried not to do. But also like one
Mm,
one thing is that idea of like if you're putting someone on to play, like you say, often you meet them and it's like you get to learn so much more about them. And
yeah.
then it's like, well, I want to get this person back, but now they've played, no, probably no one will come if we put them on again. It's like
Yeah.
one of our things is like, how can we keep putting people on like every year?
Mm,
Because if someone comes and does an amazing performance, there's no reason they shouldn't just come back and do it again.
sure.
So we've got like a number of artists that we've worked with over sort of 10 years plus, as a
Nice.
counter to
Wow.
that kind of, that festival or promoter model where it's like you only put someone on
Mm,
if they've got a new album or
yeah.
they've
It's
got new
accelerated, really.
material. I think like for me, like the biggest struggle is like the amount of I don't really do streaming stuff. So like I'm
Mm,
still like if I want to listen to something, I'll go on Bandcamp and we
mm,
have a bit of a policy like because we're publicly funded. Like I feel it's quite important if we want to hear someone's music, we should pay for it.
sure.
So I mean, I don't really preach that outside of work too much because I know it's a difficult thing for many reasons. But
Sure.
I don't use Spotify or anything like that. So if I want to hear something, I'll go and usually pay for it, download it, spend some time with it,
Sure.
or have it on like have a CD on in the car or whatever.
Mm,
So like I find this sort of like I just don't know how I would listen to everything that I want to hear. So it's that thing of
yeah.
like that's more the problem now is like the abundance rather than that the old way of like having to hunt things down that you wanted to hear,
Yeah.
like physically go and root around
Yeah.
in record shops and stuff. The fact that now like every week I can see like about 100 things that I want to listen to, but
Sure.
knowing that I'm probably not going to do it.
Yeah. I
But
think you're
that's
right. I
a
mean,
kind
I
of
see something similar. I think like what that it necessitates a type of sort of like auditory parsimony. Like you have to be quite, because you don't have time to really go through all this like super abundance of content.
no,
And it's always often sort of delivered to a listener in a superposition. Like there's just so much at once that you're not really sort of, I think in so many ways a not small portion of the most meaningful listening experiences that I've had have been either by complete chance.
Yeah.
like trance discoveries, which is why I like used to rock with things like Pandora when it came out at first, like this idea of sort of discovery and so on. But at the same juncture, like I think you got to discretize that experience. Like
Mm.
I might be listening to like an Aesop Rock album, who's my
Yeah.
favorite rapper,
Is it?
and
Yeah.
like yeah,
Yeah.
and there's like 13 like tracks. I might listen to like the first three like for 2 weeks, like just
Okay.
over and over and over
Yeah.
again. Um, I mean, obviously he's so prolix and dense in terms of his like rhyme structures and patterns and his diction. He's just the best.
Agreed.
And so like there's it's such a full meal, and it's done so with consideration for that particular end. You know, I talked to my mom about this,
Right.
sort of maybe an intergenerational thing. I remember when Prince died, and when Bowie died, and I
Mhm.
called her because I mean, her listenership has changed drastically because of her faith and so on. She listens to a lot of gospel, but
Okay.
like, I remember just like back in the day when I was a kid, she loved Prince, Peter Tosh, Burning Spear.
Yeah.
Like,
Wow.
so I called her. I was like, Ma, Prince is dead, man. It sucks. And she's just like, yeah. I'm like, I'm so sad. And then she just sort of like, wistfully reminiscing about long plays, and the whole process of listening was like, I won't go as far as to sort of be, sycophantic and call it sort of ritualized. For a lot of
Mm.
people, it is, but like
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
something about the speed at which that listening occurred,
Mm.
um, that is just. I think a lot of, the crate diggers in so many ways been replaced by like kind of a content moderator in certain
Yeah.
respects. Like,
Yeah.
and I remember things like even of the first time I listened to I heard Jai Paul, for example,
Yeah.
the mysterious Jai Paul.
Yes.
It was like through like BBC One, like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, and there was a culture that seemed to be sort of like a residue and offshoot, maybe in a sort of in diminuendo of like the Ministry of Sound and that whole sort of like raver scene and so on. But like there's a culture in and around it, a trust and investment in that listenership. Like the sets would be like an hour and a half, 2 hours
Yeah.
sometimes. But I know people who just that's all they did. They'll put it on and just like, sit, smoke or drink or whatever, and
Yeah.
just like sit and listen to it and
Yeah.
give it its full attention. And I remember when we got a record player when I used to live with my sister and her partner, her then partner in Victoria, you know, we were buying like Portishead and like,
Mm.
a lot of like Chick Corea, Davis, Fitzgerald. We're buying like a lot of like classics because we're like, it looks nice on the shelf.
Yeah.
But we also like the music.
Yeah.
And then I remember going to like the record store. I think it was called Ditch Records in Victoria. I don't think it's there anymore. And I remember going up to I was just looking at a bunch of MF Doom records. I'm like, yeah, I've already got a couple, like, and I went up to the cashier and I asked her, I said, like, look, can you give me something that sounds like the future? It
Right.
was a really, as I'm wont to do. And then she didn't say anything. She just
Mm.
turned around and went to the back and came back with this like weird, it looked like it almost looked like the Massive Attack mezzanine cover,
Okay.
like, but if the scarab had been kind of like like the rhino beetle had been exploded into like
Yeah.
oil on like a
Mhm.
white field. And she just handed it to me. And in that store, you could sample the records before you purchase them.
Right.
I didn't know what it was. It just said Flying Lotus, LA. And then
Yeah.
I listened to the first 30 seconds of Breathe Something Stellar Star, the first track, and I was like, wow. And
Mm.
I remember buying it and I listened to that for like months.
Yeah.
Like that's all I listened to. It just felt so rewarding to have taken the time to take the time, as it were, and also to take the risk, and also to defer, to sort of step outside of my own ears, as it were, and try
Mm.
to sort of like rely on somebody else's listenership, like give them a prompt in this kind of weird way and see what it was that returned. But in a very sort of human to human interaction, which leads me to this maybe the most contemporary issue and debate that I see as like an artist and a theoretician is AI, obviously.
Yeah.
Like I haven't listened to much AI music outside of like what you find on Instagram, people joking around of having like, I don't know, often in poor taste, like Mussolini having a rap battle with like Martin Luther King, and you're like, all
Yeah.
right, like okay, but what's your general view like with regards to AI in relation to music in particular? And what are some of the sort of like demerits that you see of that particular relationship? And what are some of the interesting points or lines of flight that you think are worth exploring?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I sort of tend to think like as a as someone who like did quite a conceptual fine art course, it's like it's about how you use the tools
Sure.
and what your ideas are, and and in a way like acknowledging the tools within the work and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, I think like as yet I'm really yet to hear very much that to sort of make me think about this, but
Yeah.
um, certainly not against people using it in that way. I think that that thing when it becomes just like filler or a way to generate like music as sort of content to fill playlists
Yeah.
and like kind of like almost like landfill just bulking
Yeah.
out all this we've already got like there's way too more than anyone can ever listen to already, and it's like
Yeah.
why do you produce uh more to add to that. I think that's potentially the downside.
Yeah.
I think that like the downside is not using it critically and kind of like I'm really in favor of people having access to kind of technology and tools for doing creative stuff. Um, but I think there's a danger that you miss that step of actually like
Mm.
working out what you want to do and trying stuff and it sounding a bit rubbish and then doing it again and
Sure.
improving. That if you've got something which can produce something that sounds pretty much exactly what you want the first time, it's like
Yeah.
that process of like in visual arts of like people see a painting and think like someone sat down with a canvas, and it's like in reality they did like 2 years of sketchbooks. They probably set
Yeah.
fire to like 7 or 8
Yeah.
paintings, and
Yeah.
then you get one which they probably thought was still pretty terrible, but it's the one that they it's the point where they stopped.
Sure.
It's like that's I think that stuff is really important. That kind of like the sort of failures and
Mm.
the iterations.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I mean you would know much more about this, but whether some of that is lost in in the process of using AI.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and in that sense, like then that kind of attitude that like, well, why do we need artists? Because
Hmm.
like their status the status of artists, which is like always fluctuating from being like from
Yeah.
at certain points in history, it's like they're at the
Yeah.
top of
The
the
pinnacle. Yeah.
pinnacle.
The artisan class.
And then and then other points they're like they're looked down upon as like
Yeah. Dispensable, really.
indispensable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that I think what you've really and I completely concur. I think I think the most salient risk to us in our kind of point in the Anthropocene really is a question of our relationship to time. Um, and I think that most technology is brought to bear in that sort of like commons of experience, whether that's political, economic, cultural, or ecological, is really accelerationist in nature. Whether you choose to define that as right or left accelerationist, I mean, it depends who you speak to, and what the outcomes and consequences of this acceleration might be. But one thing that it certainly does, it really limits any sense of free time. It
mm,
also places a premium on outputs as
yeah.
opposed to sort of process.
Yeah.
And I do think that the two are intimately linked indeed, but like I do think that there's a premium placed on the latter as opposed to the former.
Mm,
Um, and I've heard a lot of like I always try to see like where the most vehement arguments, quote unquote, or sentiments lie, and really try to sort of like understand why like what it is that they're not saying, what's being omitted, and in that sense might be a sort of more accurate diagnostic of sort of symptoms that people are kind of avoiding. I remember, Nathan put together sort of an unsecurities laboratory. It was an interesting workshop in the sort of like Imaginarium suite on campus. Beautiful, very interesting.
mm,
Joey Holder presented some work. Fascinating. And I remember there was this kind of group exercise where we're sort of discretized into tables and to his credit, Nathan really shuffled the deck. I mean, there was like a marine biologist, a guy from the Alan Turing Institute, a dude who like deals with asteroid mining,
right.
like Basil in sort of management, myself from English literature. It was a really strange mix. And then I could tell, I don't even know the name of the gentleman, but there was a quite a like an intensely spiky response, like to the material, shown. A kind of reticence to engage, I'll put it that way, where, as you pointed out, the ideas subtending the technology brought to bear in their reification wasn't even considered, it didn't
Yeah.
feel.
Mm,
And then we had a break. And in the break, I was like, yo, dude, not to be in your business or nothing, but like you seem to have like really big feelings about this. Like, what's that about? And then he launched into a paleontologist, I should say.
okay.
So that obviously informed his opinion, but it was really interesting and revelatory to me because he went on this interesting sort of um, excursus about the evolutionary process that turned like gills into wings.
Okay.
And then it really clicked. I understood. I was like, look, and again, not to put words in your mouth, but would it be fair to say that your biggest disquietude when it comes to what it is that you saw is that it has no history? That
Mm.
it didn't survive, it didn't struggle, it didn't
Yeah.
respond to, in a variety of iterative failures to stochastic environments in order to succeed in some respect, that in so many ways it's not indebted to history, to time. It kind of got its cake and ate it too. Like
Yeah.
its existence is unearned in certain respects in relation to time. And he's like, yeah, that's it. And I was like, right.
Right.
That makes so much sense in a variety of different ways. But then it goes back to the point that you said earlier, this kind of what you don't see as the
Yeah.
consumer of the artwork
Mm.
versus the producer of the artwork. I forget who it was, it might have been Burroughs or somebody who said like just, what keeps him awake at night is all the sort of immeasurable amount of masterpieces in New York City, like which are set fire every night that you just never know.
Yeah.
But it also reminds me of, The Alchemist talking about how he makes beats. And he's like, for me, the difficulty is like knowing when to stop.
Yeah.
Like, and that's art. Like, this part of the art, Lynch says something similar. My partner often says, like, when she's painting, like,
Yeah.
when the painting is finished is when she's decided to lay the brush down.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
you get a lot of Alchemist beats of late when like Earl
Mm.
Sweatshirt or Mike or Mavi or any of the Doom rappers are like rapping over them, and people are like, this sucks because there's no beat, like there's no percussion. It's
Mm.
just like an Aretha Franklin loop, like a weird chop.
Yeah.
And like when you see Alchemist doing it, like the sensitivity of his ear and the creativity of the mélange, I don't know how you could say that that is not artistic,
No.
despite the
No.
fact that the output might be ostensibly simple. And I think the tension between those two things and the acceleration of that process for the ostensible value of the outcome, despite the fact that it's constantly denuded of value anyway,
Yeah.
in this kind of capitalist milieu, I think is a really interesting tension, a sort of frisson, and I don't know, I can't rightly call it. I don't know where it's going, but it's really interesting to sort of to unspool, which kind of, I guess, brings me to maybe a concluding question. And it's because you work in the sort of, yeah, in this Wagnerian way, that there's many ways that sound is inflected on its own, with a variety of different technologies, electronic and acoustic alike, but at the same time, with, against, underneath, ahead of images.
Mm.
And like, what are your thoughts about the audio visual relationship?
Mm.
Because it's in so many ways such a catch-all for a lot of people. But like, I don't think a lot of people really think about how they work together and against one another. So I mean, what are your general feelings about audio visuality? It's a big question, I guess, but
Yeah. Yeah, tricky one. I think yeah, I mean, I think when we started, there was like in like 15 years ago, there was a big push. There was this kind of idea that like really you couldn't perform particular
mm,
electronic music unless you had visuals or unless you were making a soundtrack to a Blade Runner or something.
yeah,
And yeah, and I think like that produced some good work, but also produced kind of a lot of, again, like almost like filler, because I think
mm,
that problem, that perceived problem of like someone standing at a table with some
yeah,
electronics isn't
like a
interesting.
laptop,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. It's like, and I feel like there was a big, like that created a bit of a sort of evolutionary moment where it's like everyone had to have visuals, and then
Yeah,
and then suddenly, like, people who were playing like proper instruments also had to have visuals.
yeah,
And I think, yeah, a lot of the time, I know, like when we started, a lot of the time we were sort of questioning that, to the point where we did a festival where we didn't let anyone have like even electricity. So it was like, it's like,
whoa,
if you're gonna have visuals, it's like, you're gonna have to do it in you're gonna have to do it in an analog way, or just,
yeah,
or just have lots of people.
interesting.
So we did a whole like part of a festival where there were two concerts where it was people playing with that idea of like, like we did a sort of 5.1 surround concert, and it was four trombonists and a tuba. Um,
Mm.
and then, yeah, so making a sort of like a surround sound or electroacoustic type experience, but with acoustic instruments. And then getting people that would normally do electronics or amplified instruments to arrange stuff for handbells and voices, and
Mm,
just looking at that kind of idea that actually like a lot of experimental practice is like rooted in like early music or
hmm.
tradition, traditional music. So yeah, I think that like that at that point, definitely it seemed often seemed a bit shoehorned in. I think now like seems to people seem to like be a bit more considered in a way about how they
Mm,
use visuals. I think like Generate doesn't it doesn't quite wind me up as much as it maybe did at some point.
sure,
I think there's more yeah, it's more sort of consideration goes into it in a lot of ways, and also like the tools are much easier
sure,
to access. So like people, you can make really impressive films with less budget and stuff,
sure.
and there's less of that kind of like not very good generative stuff. Which I mean, I do like. I mean, I do really like that early kind of like
Yeah,
Orteca and stuff like that. That those early visuals like really astonishing. But
craft
then you
work too. Like,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
yeah,
But then you get the kind of like the yeah. Again, like when it comes down to the point where you can make that stuff quite easily, then people stop thinking about
sure.
what they're doing, and you get stuff that becomes a bit screensavery. But I think, yeah, I
Yeah,
suppose I'm trying to think about now, and I think I think a bit like with everything, it's like it's much harder to see sort of trends. I think we do have a moving image strand as well, and I think like
mm,
um sort of we're always looking for sort of film work and moving image work that deals with that sort of relationship between sound and image. I think, yeah, I've sort of done quite a bit of film programming as well on top of like
mm.
music, and I was sort of really influenced. On my degree, I went to see like every like Jean-Luc Godard film ever made, and when it got into the 70s, and he's doing the stuff where there's like a blank screen and two people
Yeah.
talking different languages, and it hadn't even been subtitled, so there's someone at the back of the room like live translating it into headphones. So I was kind of like had some really
Wow.
deep experiences then
Yeah,
of
yeah,
like kind of like yeah text and image sound, like really pulling them apart and seeing
for
what the
sure.
possibilities are. So um
And it's a standing relationship. I mean, it's one that's, yeah, I mean, like post, like, yeah, gosh. I mean, even like just post Lumiere brothers. Like, I mean, I'm talking like Eisenstein, Kuleshov.
yeah
Like, if you look at, you look at his like, his storyboards and stuff, it's so like sonically influenced.
yeah
Even the way in which he understands montage,
yeah
that Russian formalist montage is so musical.
it is, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
even the way it's drawn out, no pun,
Mm,
etc. It's like so cinematically influenced. And I think then there was a really deep consideration as to sort of how the two semiological systems butt up against one another, but could
yeah
also buttress and buoy each other.
mm,
And I think I'm with you. I think you go to like Coachella or something, and it's like if you're just throwing on like a 3D hologram of Tupac just for like the lols or like the
mm,
the novelty, I'm like, sure, but what that might do is to sort of engender what I think is a really terrible habit in the contemporary listenership is this kind of broader death grip of the imagination, when like the levels of stimuli need to sort of cross certain thresholds to hold people's attention.
yeah yeah
Like,
yeah
I think that's so ruinous to the idea of like a meaningful experience. And I'm not trying to sort of be doctrinaire as to sort of what that might be, but like, geez, I do think that like more time needs to be given. And I do think that like it's a shame for like, I mean, you look at as in my half module, like one of the live pieces of music recorded that I show like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I saw
yeah
like pretty weird stuff. But then I showed Daedalus, just like with his
okay
like his monomy and so on. And like some of my students, you just look at their faces, and some of them are just like is he playing it?
right
Like is he just pushing buttons? Or
mm,
like, whoa, like how much of what I'm hearing is his? This these
yeah
these these very capitalist influenced ideas of ownership, even of sound and performance, and the assemblage of those particular elements. Like it acts as such a barrier to immersion in some instances. Well, a lot of them are just like so blown away to be like, whoa, like this is so sci-fi and futuristic. And he has no images, but
no
obviously the monomy in and of itself is kind of an art piece.
yeah
I mean, it's a,
yeah
it's a feat of engineering, but it's also like it's glittering lights. Like it's
yeah
it's 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 like attractive and attentive in that attraction. Whereas I've played a couple of gigs where, it'll be not only how people trying to curate the space within which it takes place to make it more quote unquote interesting than me just like grooving out on like an MPD 26
Yeah.
and like a laptop. But then the stuff that they play behind you, like as in my, I'm like, what this has nothing to do with anything. Like
No,
it's
no.
like a random like Revlon commercial from 1994. Like it's cool as like a weird like artifact, but like it's so ill-considered insofar as this kind of melange. And I think that's the risk that it can people can just look at it as an addition to a stimuli that they don't think is there sonically
Yeah.
in response to this attrition of attention that they have to sort of cultivate and maintain. I think that's an interesting commentary, and I love the way that you addressed it insofar as putting certain parameters on certain types of sound making,
Mm.
electronic or acoustic, and forcing people who have facility in one regime to adapt to another. Like, I think that's a really cool way of interrogating that. Really, really cool.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Reminds me, I mean, I like discovered Peter Cherkasky not too long ago.
Okay.
It's weird experimental film guy. He has he has a movie on YouTube called Outer Space. Like
Okay.
he's uploaded it. It's like it's so wild, like it's just so weird. But it's so arresting and beautiful, but like sonically intense. And I do think maybe I'm thinking of a lot of sound artists that I know, a lot of
Mm.
performance artists that I know, and a lot of experimental filmmakers that I know. They kind of take a huge swing in the opposite direction, which kind of feels vindictive to some degree or
Mm.
other, or certainly reactive to be like, word, okay. So if you want something to pay attention to, I'm going to give you something to pay attention to. And they just like kind of like they do something that is outside of what it is that they want to do, but like it's such a retaliatory response to the attention that they feel like the true work that they want to produce deserves, but can't accrue on its own standing.
Okay.
And it feels like a fight. Like there's
Right.
this kind of combative quality that I'm like, it's really interesting to see like this fight for attention.
Hmm.
Um, but also a recognition full well that in some instances that's like a fool's errand. Like it's kind of a silly hill to die on. And there's so many different ways in which I've seen artists deal with this. Like the Afro pessimists, for example. There's Earl Sweatshirt had this like conversation with his mom, I think at like Brown University.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's a professor there, I think, that there or Harvard, she's one of the Ivy Leagues. And this dude asked him such a good question, and he gave kind of a shoddy response. I love Earl, but it was like not the greatest response. The dude asked him, he was like, "Look, of late, you've been working with alchemists. You've been making these really weird, like experimental rap
Hmm.
albums. And even your rap structure, your bars, it's not verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end. Like it's not 16 bar phrases either.
No.
Like, and even your patterns, like you're sort of like you're ahead of the beat, you're behind it, but not in like a mumble rap kind of way.
Hmm.
Like so and the question was like, by virtue of the fact that like black music and black identity is already so incomprehensible to a white imaginary that you're under no obligation to make yourself understood.
Yeah.
Like, are you liberated from that Bataille uses a fantastic word, ossature, like the
Hmm.
sort of the skeleton. Are you free from it? And then Earl's answers about like coded language and like it's not the worst answer, but it's not. So the question like really has got me thinking like about like limits of participation, limits of
Yeah.
comprehensibility.
Hmm.
What obligations do we have to being understood
Yeah.
or being understandable in any kind of like referential system? And what you're doing like sounds like it's so thoughtful in terms of like these questions, these latent, questions of praxis. So good
Yeah.
work, man.
Hopefully. Yeah. No, that's yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's been like yeah, so many of the things you've just like raised great examples of things which I also love. Most all those things you mentioned.
Yeah.